Welcome to the Lord of the Dark. The Daemonculaba, experiments conducted by the Iron Warriors Chaos Space Marines, represent one of the most horrifying atrocities in the entire setting. Hansu and the warsmith Barban Falk created grotesque living factories by surgically modifying captured human women into biological incubators, force-feeding them gene seed and planting captive children inside their mutilated bodies to create new Chaos Space Marines. The failures, skinless, screaming abominations called the Unfleshed, were cast into pits to die, while the successes emerged as twisted mockeries of Astartes, born from unimaginable suffering and violation. Let's talk about one of the most horrifying, stomach-churning atrocities ever committed in the grim darkness of the far future, the Daemonculaba. This isn't just another war crime in a galaxy filled with them. This is something that makes even hardened fans of Warhammer 40k pause and wonder just how dark this setting can actually get. The answer? Darker than you ever wanted to imagine. The Daemonculaba represents the absolute rock bottom of what Chaos Space Marines are capable of, a biological nightmare factory that turned human suffering into a production line for new warriors. But to understand how such an abomination came to exist, we need to go back to where it all started, a fortress world called Hydra Cordatus, and the theft that would fuel this horror. Hydra Cordatus was one of those worlds that existed for a single purpose, and that purpose was guarding something the Imperium considered more precious than almost any other resource in existence. Deep beneath its surface, protected by massive fortifications and an entire garrison of Imperial fists, Space Marines, lay a vault containing thousands upon thousands of gene seed samples. Now, if you're not familiar with why gene seed matters so much, here's the short version. It's literally the genetic material that creates Space Marines. Without gene seed, you cannot make new Astartes. Period. Every chapter guards their gene seed with fanatical devotion, because losing it means extinction for their bloodline. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains tithe records, demanding regular contributions from every chapter, and Hydra Cordatus served as one of these collection points. The vault there contained gene seed from dozens of chapters accumulated over centuries, representing the potential for thousands of future Space Marines. The Iron Warriors wanted it. All of it. Now, the Iron Warriors have always been the siege specialists of the Traitor Legions. Where other Chaos warbands might rely on demonic pacts or raw aggression, the Iron Warriors approach warfare like engineers approach a demolition project. They calculate, they plan, they identify structural weaknesses, and then they methodically tear everything apart. Their warsmith, a brutal commander named Foryx, led the initial assault alongside other notable Iron Warriors, including a half-breed captain named Hansu. This wasn't some reckless charge. It was a meticulously planned siege operation designed to crack open one of the most heavily defended positions in the sector. The defenders knew they were in trouble from the moment the Iron Warriors' fleet appeared in orbit. The Imperial Fists garrison, led by Castellan Vauban, prepared for the worst, but nothing could truly prepare them for what was coming. The Iron Warriors brought everything: siege tanks, demon engines, thousands of cultist cannon fodder, and the kind of patience that only beings who have been waging war for 10,000 years can possess. They didn't need to rush. They had all the time in the universe, and they knew that every fortress eventually falls. What followed was a grinding, brutal siege that showcased exactly why the Iron Warriors earned their fearsome reputation. They systematically dismantled the outer defenses, each victory purchased with acceptable losses that would have horrified any loyalist commander. The Iron Warriors simply didn't care how many of their own died, as long as the walls kept crumbling. They used their cultist auxiliaries as living shields, sent waves of expendable troops against fortified positions just to identify firing lanes, and employed siege weapons that could level entire city blocks with single shots. The Imperial fists fought with characteristic stubbornness, making the traitors pay for every meter of ground. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The really twisted part? The Iron Warriors weren't just fighting for territory or glory. They were fighting for something far more practical and far more sinister. They needed that gene seed because their legion had a problem. They couldn't replace their losses fast enough through conventional means. The Chaos Space Marines don't have access to the Imperium's recruitment worlds and training facilities. They can't simply requisition new aspirants from compliant populations. Every warrior they lose is incredibly difficult to replace, and the Iron Warriors had been bleeding strength for millennia. That vault represented a solution, a way to rebuild their numbers without depending on the slow trickle of recruits and renegades that normally sustain traitor warbands. When the fortress finally fell, the Iron Warriors descended into those vaults like locusts. They took everything, every single vial of gene seed, every genetic sample, every piece of biological material that could potentially be used to create new Astartes. The scale of the theft was staggering. We're talking about genetic material that represented centuries of careful cultivation. Enough raw material to theoretically create an entire chapter's worth of Space Marines. In Imperial terms, this wasn't just a military defeat. It was a catastrophe that would echo through the centuries. But here's what makes this theft truly significant in the context of what came later. The Iron Warriors didn't steal this gene seed to use it in any normal fashion. They weren't planning to establish recruitment worlds or set up proper implantation facilities. No, they had something far more ambitious and far more horrifying in mind. The gene seed from Hydra Caudatus would become the raw material for an experiment that would make the Dark Eldar's homunculi look almost restrained by comparison. It would fuel the creation of the Demenculaba, and the suffering of Hydra Caudatus would pale compared to what that stolen genetic material would eventually enable. Now, to understand why the Demenculaba even exists, you need to understand the half-breed bastard who made it all possible, Hansu. This guy isn't your typical Iron Warriors warlord. He's something far more dangerous, a survivor, a schemer, and a warrior with absolutely nothing to lose and everything to prove. His very existence is an insult to purists within the Legion, and that chip on his shoulder drove him to commit some of the most unspeakable acts in the entire setting. Hanso's gene seed isn't pure Iron Warrior stock. Part of his genetic heritage comes from the Imperial fists harvested from defeated enemies during the Long War. In the rigid, tradition-obsessed culture of the traitor legions, this makes him an abomination in the eyes of many of his brothers. He's called half-breed, mongrel, tainted slurs that would break lesser men but only hardened Hansu into something far more ruthless. He learned early that respect among the Iron Warriors isn't given. It's taken. Usually at the point of a blade, usually from the corpse of whoever stood in your way. And Hansu, he took everything he could. His rise through the ranks wasn't through noble combat or strategic brilliance alone, though he possessed both in abundance. It was through sheer bloody-minded determination and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive and advance. The Iron Warriors are siege specialists, methodical and patient. But Hansu brought something else to the table, a feral cunning that made him unpredictable. He didn't just follow the established paths to power. He carved new ones through the bodies of his rivals and enemies alike. The siege of Hydra Cordatus wasn't just a military victory for Hansu. It was his coronation. When the dust settled and the gene seed vaults lay open, he had proven himself worthy of command in the most Iron Warrior's way possible, through overwhelming success. The warsmith who led the assault recognized Hansu's contributions and rewarded him accordingly. But more importantly, the victory gave Hansu something he desperately needed: legitimacy. No one could call him half-breed and dismiss him anymore. He had earned his place through fire and blood, and he had the spoils to prove it. But here's where things get complicated, and where the seeds of the Daemonculaba were truly planted. Victory at Hydra Cordatus came at a tremendous cost. The Iron Warriors suffered horrific casualties during the siege. Astartes don't grow on trees. Each Space Marine represents decades of investment, training, and biological modification. Losing brothers in battle is always painful for any legion, but for the Iron Warriors operating in the Eye of Terror, far from any reliable recruitment worlds or functioning apothecarian facilities, those losses were potentially catastrophic. Hansu found himself in command of a warband that was bleeding strength. Every battle claimed more of his warriors. And unlike the Loyalist chapters, who could draw upon established recruitment worlds and the institutional support of the Imperium, Chaos Space Marines have to fend for themselves. The traditional methods of creating new Astartes require time, resources, and expertise that most Chaos warbands simply don't possess. Gene seed must be implanted into compatible hosts, who must then survive years of brutal modification and training. The failure rate is astronomical even under ideal conditions. For a warband operating from the twisted hellscape of the Eye of Terror, those conditions were anything but ideal. This is the cruel mathematics that drives so much of what the traitor legions do. They're a dying breed, slowly bleeding out over 10,000 years of endless warfare. Every Marine lost is a wound that might never heal. Every battle won is Pyrrhic if it costs too many irreplaceable warriors. The Long War isn't just a conflict of ideology or vengeance. It's a desperate struggle for survival against the inevitable erosion of their numbers. And Hansu, for all his cunning and ambition, was staring down the barrel of that extinction. The gene seed stolen from Hydra Cordatus represented potential, but potential means nothing without the means to realize it. Hansu had thousands of progenoid glands, the biological foundation of Space Marine creation, but he lacked the facilities, the expertise, and most importantly, the time to use them through conventional means. Building a proper recruitment and modification program would take decades, maybe centuries. His warband didn't have that kind of time. His rivals certainly wouldn't give it to him. In the Eye of Terror, weakness is an invitation to annihilation, and a warband that can't replenish its losses is weak. So Hansu did what Hansu always does. He found another way. If the traditional methods were too slow, too resource-intensive, too unreliable, then he would find methods that weren't traditional at all. The Iron Warriors have always prided themselves on adaptation, on solving problems through engineering and innovation. They build siege works and demon engines. They blend technology and warpcraft in ways that would make the Mechanicum weep with horror and envy. Why should the creation of new warriors be any different? This desperate need for fresh bodies, combined with Hansu's utter lack of moral restraint and his burning ambition to build something lasting, created the perfect conditions for atrocity. He wasn't going to let his warband wither away while he clutched useless gene seed. He wasn't going to watch his power base crumble because he lacked the warriors to hold it. He would find a way to turn that stolen genetic treasure into an army no matter how monstrous the method required. And, fortunately for Hansu, unfortunately for countless innocent victims, he knew exactly who could help him realize this nightmare vision. So, Hansu had the gene seed. Thousands of precious genetic legacies stolen from the corpses of Imperial fists and torn from the vaults of Hydra Cordatus. He had the ambition burning in his chest like a cold fire, that desperate need to prove himself worthy despite the tainted blood flowing through his veins. But ambition and raw materials alone don't create Space Marines. The process of transforming a human child into an Astartes is one of the most complex, demanding, and resource-intensive procedures in the entire Imperium. It requires decades of accumulated knowledge, specialized facilities, trained apothecaries, and most importantly, time. Time that Hansu simply didn't have. The Iron Warriors were bleeding warriors faster than they could replace them, and the traditional methods of recruitment were laughably inadequate for a legion that had turned its back on everything the Imperium represented. They couldn't exactly set up recruiting worlds and training facilities like their loyalist counterparts. They were raiders, reavers, creatures of the Eye of Terror, who struck from the shadows and disappeared before retribution could find them. So how do you solve an impossible problem? You find someone whose mind operates on a completely different wavelength of madness, someone who looks at the laws of nature and sees them not as boundaries but as suggestions. Enter Barban Falk, the warsmith whose vision would birth the Demonculaba. Barban Falk was old, incredibly, impossibly old, by the standards of even Chaos Space Marines. He had walked the long war since its earliest days, had witnessed the betrayal at Istvan, had seen the walls of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra. 10,000 years of warfare, scheming, and survival in the hellish realm of the Eye of Terror had twisted his mind into something that barely resembled sanity anymore. But here's the thing about madness in the service of chaos. Sometimes it grants insights that rational minds could never achieve. Falk had spent millennia contemplating the problem that plagued every traitor legion: how to replenish their numbers without access to the vast recruiting infrastructure of the Imperium. The Loyalists had entire worlds dedicated to producing new Astartes, fleets of ships carrying chaplains and apothecaries to harvest promising candidates, fortress monasteries equipped with the most advanced medical technology available. The traitor legions had none of this. They had to make do with what they could steal, scavenge, or corrupt. And it was never enough. The mathematics of attrition were slowly grinding them down, and Falk refused to accept that fate. His solution was elegant in its absolute horror. If you can't replicate the sophisticated technology and careful procedures of Imperial Space Marine creation, why not bypass them entirely? Why not find a different path, one that used biology itself as the manufacturing process? The human body is, after all, the most sophisticated biological machine in existence. Women carry children within their bodies, nurturing them, growing them from single cells into complete human beings. What if that process could be corrupted, perverted, scaled up to produce something far more terrible than mere human children? What if the womb itself could be transformed into a factory for creating warriors? This was the seed of the idea that would eventually become the Demonculaba, and it festered in Falk's mind for centuries before he found the opportunity to make it reality. The concept drew on forbidden knowledge from multiple sources. Falk had studied the gene seed extensively, understanding its function as a biological template that transforms baseline humans into Astartes. He had examined the warp's ability to mutate and reshape flesh in ways that defied conventional biology. He had observed the Dark Mechanicum's experiments with flesh grafting and biological augmentation, and somewhere in that toxic stew of corrupted science and demonic inspiration, he conceived of a process that would combine all these elements into something unprecedented. The gene seed would provide the genetic template. Human women would provide the biological incubation chambers. Warp energy would accelerate and twist the growth process. And the suffering, because there is always suffering when chaos is involved, would fuel the entire obscene mechanism. But Falk understood that this vision required resources he didn't possess on his own. He needed subjects for experimentation, lots of them, because a process this radical would inevitably require countless failures before achieving any success. He needed a secure location where the work could proceed without interruption, somewhere the Imperium couldn't easily reach. He needed warriors to protect the facility and raid for fresh materials. And most importantly, he needed a patron, a warsmith with enough power and ambition to support such a massive undertaking. For years, perhaps centuries, Falk searched for the right opportunity, the right partner in atrocity. And then Hansu conquered Medrengard, bringing with him thousands of stolen gene seed and a burning need for exactly what Falk was offering. The half-breed and the ancient warsmith recognized kindred spirits in each other, both outsiders, both willing to cross any line in pursuit of their goals, both utterly without mercy or moral limitation. Their partnership would birth nightmares. Falk presented his vision to Hansu with the enthusiasm of a twisted artist unveiling his masterwork. He spoke of efficiency, of production rates that would dwarf anything the traitor legions had achieved before. He described how they would transform captured women into living factories, their bodies surgically modified to serve as incubation chambers for developing Astartes. He explained how they would use the stolen gene seed to provide the genetic foundation, how warp energies would accelerate the growth process from decades to mere months, how the children implanted within these modified hosts would emerge as fully developed Chaos Space Marines, ready for war. It was insane. It was impossible by any conventional understanding of biology or medicine. And Hansu loved it immediately because it promised him exactly what he needed: an army of his own creation, warriors who owed their existence entirely to him, loyal not to the ancient traditions of the Iron Warriors, but to the half-breed who had given them life. The machinery of atrocity requires fuel. And for the Daemonculaba, that fuel was human suffering in its purest, most innocent form. Hansu and Barban Falk had their twisted blueprint, their stolen gene seed, their fortress of iron and malice. But the biological factories they envisioned needed raw materials of a very specific kind. Human women to serve as the living incubators, and young boys to serve as the seed from which new Chaos Space Marines would be grown. The procurement of these victims became an operation of systematic horror that stretched across multiple worlds and demonstrated just how efficiently the Iron Warriors could industrialize cruelty. The raids began almost immediately after the gene seed reached Midrengard. Iron Warriors' strike forces, accompanied by hordes of enslaved human soldiers and mutant auxiliaries, descended upon Imperial worlds with a very specific shopping list. They weren't interested in military targets or strategic objectives in the traditional sense. They wanted populations. Specifically, they wanted women of childbearing age and male children young enough to potentially survive the Astartes transformation process. The age range they sought for the boys was roughly 8 to 14 standard Terran years, the window during which the human body could theoretically accept the cascade of genetic modifications required to create a space marine. Any younger and the subjects would simply die from the strain. Any older and their bodies would reject the implants with fatal consequences. The selection process on the rated worlds was brutal in its efficiency. Iron warriors and their mortal servants would sweep through population centers, separating families with the cold precision of farmers culling livestock. Women were evaluated based on physical health, body structure, and reproductive capability. Those deemed suitable were dragged screaming from their homes, from their husbands, from their other children who didn't meet the age requirements. The boys were subjected to even more rigorous examination. Iron warriors apothecaries, their medical knowledge twisted by millennia of service to chaos, would test reflexes, measure bone density, evaluate genetic markers, and assess overall physical potential. Only the strongest, the healthiest, the most genetically promising specimens were selected for transport to Medrengard. The rejected were not simply released. Witnesses to Iron Warriors' operations could not be permitted to spread word of what they had seen. And besides, even the unsuitable had their uses. Those too old, too young, or too physically compromised to serve in the Demanculaba were either executed on the spot or taken as Genri slave labor for the countless other projects that consumed resources in Honso's fortress. Families were torn apart with absolute indifference to the psychological devastation inflicted. Mothers watched daughters deemed unacceptable shot through the head while they themselves were dragged toward the transport ships. Fathers were forced to kneel in the blood of their wives while their sons were carried away to a fate infinitely worse than the quick death that awaited the parents. The Iron Warriors viewed these scenes not with pleasure necessarily, but with complete emotional detachment. This was simply resource acquisition, nothing more. The journey to Medrengard was itself a crucible of suffering that began to break down the captives' will to resist. Packed into the holds of Iron Warriors' vessels, the women and children were given barely enough food and water to survive the transit through the warp. The corridors of these ships echoed with the sounds of weeping, of prayers to an emperor who seemed impossibly distant, of children calling for parents they would never see again. Some captives died during transit. The weak, the sick, those whose hearts simply gave out from terror and despair. Their bodies were recycled into the nutrient base that fed the survivors. Nothing was wasted in the Iron Warriors' economy of flesh. Upon arrival at Medrengard, the captives were processed with industrial efficiency that would have impressed the most ruthless imperial administrative facility. Women were separated from the children entirely, taken to different sections of the fortress where their transformation into Demanculaba would begin. The boys were herded into massive holding pens, hundreds of terrified children crammed into spaces designed to hold perhaps a third of their number. Here they waited, some for days, some for weeks, watching as their numbers slowly diminished as batches were taken away to face the implantation process. Those who returned were changed, hollow-eyed, traumatized, bearing the fresh scars of surgical modification. Those who didn't return at all were the lucky ones, though the survivors couldn't know that yet. The psychological conditioning began immediately. The children were deliberately kept in a state of constant fear and uncertainty, never knowing when they would be taken, never knowing what awaited them when their turn came. They were fed just enough to maintain their physical health, but kept hungry enough that food became a tool of control. They were subjected to random acts of violence by their guards, beatings, mutilations, executions of randomly selected individuals, to ensure that hope never had a chance to take root. The Iron Warriors understood that breaking the spirit made the flesh more compliant, and compliant flesh survived the transformation process at marginally higher rates than flesh that still harbored the will to resist. The women faced their own preparatory horrors. Before they could serve as Demonculaba, their bodies needed to be modified extensively, and that process required them to be alive and conscious for much of the surgical work. They were fed specialized nutrient compounds designed to increase their body mass dramatically, force-fed through tubes when they refused to eat voluntarily. Their abdominal cavities needed to be expanded to accommodate the implantation of human children. And that expansion was achieved through a combination of surgery and forced feeding that left them bloated, barely recognizable as human. The screaming from the women's sections of the fortress never stopped, a constant soundtrack of agony that the children in the holding pens could hear through the walls, a preview of the suffering that awaited them in a different form. What makes this selection and procurement process so disturbing isn't just the physical cruelty, though. That would be enough. It's the systematic nature of it, the way the Iron Warriors reduced human beings to components in a manufacturing process. There was no hatred in their actions, no sadistic pleasure of the kind a Drukhari might take. There was simply efficiency. The cold calculation of how many subjects were needed, how many could be acquired per raid, what the acceptable loss rates were during transit and processing. The Iron Warriors had taken the imperial process of creating Space Marines, already a brutal transformation that killed many aspirants, and stripped away every last vestige of honor, purpose, or meaning. They had created a supply chain of souls. What happened to the women selected for the Demonculaba wasn't surgery in any medical sense. It was desecration. It was the systematic destruction of everything that made them human, while keeping them alive to serve a function so obscene that even describing it feels like participating in the violation. Barbon Falk approached their bodies the way a particularly sadistic engineer might approach raw materials, something to be cut, reshaped, hollowed out, and repurposed with absolutely no consideration for the screaming, suffering consciousness trapped inside. The transformation began almost immediately after selection. The Iron Warriors wasted no time understanding that the psychological destruction of their victims actually served their purposes. A broken mind offered less resistance, and resistance complicated the procedures. The women were taken to surgical chambers that looked nothing like any medical facility in the Imperium. These were torture rooms dressed up with the trappings of biological science, filled with rusted tools, stained tables, and the lingering stench of old blood and newer terror. Servitors with dead eyes and mechanical limbs assisted in the procedures, their lobotomized brains incapable of understanding the horrors their hands performed. The first modifications focused on capacity. A normal human woman's body simply cannot contain a growing Space Marine aspirant in any meaningful way. The Astartes transformation process requires space, requires biological resources far beyond what any natural pregnancy demands. So Barbon Falk had to create that space artificially, and he did so with a brutality that defies comprehension. Internal organs deemed unnecessary were simply removed. The digestive system was radically altered, shortened, and rerouted to maximize the body cavity available for incubation. Ribs were broken, cut away, or reshaped to allow for expansion beyond anything natural. The spine was reinforced with crude metal supports because the natural human skeleton simply couldn't support the grotesque weights these women would eventually carry. The skin itself became a problem to solve. Human skin has limits to how much it can stretch, and those limits fell far short of what the Damantiolaba required. So the Iron Warriors treated the skin like leather to be worked, cutting it in precise patterns, grafting additional tissue harvested from other victims, and treating the flesh with chemical compounds that increased elasticity while deadening nerve responses. Not completely deadening them, of course. Complete numbness would have interfered with the biological feedback loops necessary for the process. The women needed to feel enough to keep their bodies functioning, just not enough to die from shock. Finding that balance required experimentation, and the Iron Warriors had plenty of test subjects to work through. Feeding tubes were installed directly into their modified digestive systems. The Damantiolaba couldn't eat normally. Their mouths were often sewn partially shut or modified beyond the ability to chew. Instead, a constant flow of nutrient slurry was pumped directly into them. A foul mixture of processed organic matter, growth hormones, chemical supplements, and substances that even the Iron Warriors' own records describe only in the vaguest terms. Some fans speculate that warp-tainted materials were included in this mixture, that the nourishment itself carried corruption. It would explain why the Damantiolaba eventually became something more than just modified humans, why they seemed to exist in a state between life and death that no purely physical modification could achieve. The reproductive systems were, of course, the primary focus of modification. But calling what the Iron Warriors did modification feels like a grotesque understatement. These organs were weaponized, transformed into biological factories that bore no resemblance to their original function. The womb became an incubation chamber, reinforced, expanded, and connected to external systems that monitored and controlled the environment inside. Artificial amniotic fluids replaced natural ones, fluids saturated with gene seed compounds and growth accelerants that would force the development of whatever was placed inside. Hormone regulation was taken over entirely by external systems. The women's own endocrine systems were either suppressed or removed entirely, replaced by chemical injectors that maintained precisely calculated levels of dozens of different compounds. Too much of one hormone might kill the developing subject. Too little of another might slow growth beyond acceptable parameters. The Iron Warriors had learned these ratios through extensive trial and error, through hundreds of failed experiments that produced only corpses and screaming failures. By the time the Damantiolaba reached operational status, they had refined their chemical formulas to something approaching reliability, though the process remained far from perfect. What strikes fans most about these surgical procedures is their mechanical nature. There was no sadism for its own sake, no torture purely for the pleasure of inflicting pain. The Iron Warriors approached this horror with the same cold efficiency they brought to siege warfare. Every cut served a purpose. Every modification had a function. The suffering of the victims wasn't the goal. It was simply irrelevant. And somehow, that makes it worse. A sadist can be reasoned with, can be satisfied, can grow bored. But engineers simply optimize. They refine their processes. They find more efficient methods. The women transformed into Damantiolaba weren't being punished. They were being manufactured. And that complete absence of malice in the execution of such absolute evil represents something uniquely horrifying about the Iron Warriors and chaos itself. The surgical horrors were only the preparation. The true nightmare began when the Damantiolaba were put to their intended purpose. When young boys captured from imperial worlds were brought before these mutilated women and subjected to a process that defies every natural law of biology and decency. The implantation wasn't a medical procedure. It was a violation of reality itself, a forced merger of stolen genetic legacy, innocent flesh, and suffering so profound that it seemed to please the dark gods themselves. The boys selected for implantation had already endured horrors that would break most adults. They had watched their families die, their homes burn, their worlds fall to the iron tide of Honsu's forces. They had been sorted and evaluated like livestock, the weak and the flawed discarded to fates perhaps even worse than what awaited the chosen. But nothing in their experience of suffering could prepare them for what came next. They were brought to the Daimoncula chambers, those cathedral-like halls of flesh and iron, where the transformed women hung in their mechanical cradles, their distended bodies pulsing with unnatural life. The process began with the gene seed. Each precious gland, stolen from the corpses of loyalist space marines or harvested from failed experiments, was prepared through rituals that blended chaos sorcery with twisted biological science. The Iron Warriors had millennia of experience with gene seed implantation, but the traditional methods required extensive surgical facilities, years of careful monitoring, and a failure rate that was simply unacceptable given their limited resources. The Daimoncula was meant to circumvent all of these limitations by using the human body itself as the surgical theater, the monitoring system, and the growth medium all in one. The children were sedated, though not always completely. Some accounts suggest that Barb and Falk believed a certain level of consciousness during the process improved the chances of success, that the fear and pain of the subject somehow catalyzed the gene seed integration. Whether this was genuine scientific observation or simply sadistic preference remains unclear, but the result was the same. Boys who should have been playing in hab-block corridors or learning their letters in Skolum classrooms instead found themselves being pushed into openings that should never have existed, forced inside the bodies of women who had been transformed into living wombs of corruption. The implantation itself was achieved through the surgical modifications made to the Daimoncula. The massive abdominal openings, kept viable through dark technology and warp-tainted flesh, allowed the children to be inserted directly into the biological cavity that had been prepared for them. Once inside, the opening was sealed through a combination of surgical intervention and the unnatural healing properties that chaos corruption granted the host bodies. The children were now entombed in living flesh, surrounded by biological systems that had been repurposed for a single terrible function. Inside the Daimoncula, the real transformation began. The environment was a nightmare of biological processes gone wrong, of organs that had been reshaped to pump nutrients, hormones, and gene seed byproducts directly into the implanted child. The gene seed organs, those sacred implants that normally required careful surgical placement over years of development, were instead forced to integrate through sheer biological pressure. The progenoid glands, the secondary heart, the osmodula, the biscopia, all the organs that transform a human into something greater, were essentially grown into the child through the medium of the Daimoncula's corrupted flesh. The incubation period was mercifully shorter than traditional Astartes creation, but this speed came at a terrible cost. Where normal space marine development took years of careful cultivation, the Daimoncula forced the process into months, perhaps weeks. The children's bodies were subjected to transformation rates that would kill them under normal circumstances, kept alive only through the constant flow of nutrients and the reality-bending influence of chaos. They grew inside their living prisons, their bones lengthening and thickening, their muscles multiplying, their organs reshaping themselves according to the genetic blueprint encoded in the stolen gene seed. But the process was far from perfect. The speed of transformation meant that development was uneven, chaotic in the most literal sense. Some organs would grow too fast, others too slow. Bones might fuse incorrectly or grow in directions that nature never intended. The black carapace, that final implant that allows a space marine to interface with their armor, often failed to develop properly or grew in patches that left the subject in constant agony. And through it all, the children were aware. Not fully conscious perhaps, but aware enough to feel their bodies being torn apart and rebuilt, aware enough to experience every moment of their transformation into something inhuman. The Daemonculaba themselves suffered throughout this process. Despite the modifications meant to keep them docile, despite the removal of everything that might allow them to resist, they still felt. Some say their muffled screams could be heard throughout the chambers, a constant backdrop of agony that the Iron Warriors either ignored or actively enjoyed. The process of carrying a transforming Astartes was destroying them from the inside, their bodies being consumed to fuel the growth of the monsters being born within them. Many died during incubation, their bodies finally giving out under the strain. And when this happened, the implanted children usually died with them. This was the Daemonculaba at its most fundamental, a system designed to birth warriors from pure suffering. The emergence from the Daemonculaba wasn't birth in any sense that word should ever be used. It was an expulsion, a violent rejection of flesh from flesh, a tearing passage from one nightmare into another. The boys who had been implanted into those mutilated women, the ones who survived the incubation process, who didn't simply dissolve into biological slurry or suffocate in the crushing darkness of those distended wombs, eventually had to come out. And the manner of their emergence was every bit as horrific as everything that preceded it. The Daemonculaba didn't give birth the way human women do. Their bodies had been so extensively modified, so grotesquely expanded and surgically altered, that the process more closely resembled industrial extraction than childbirth. The massive abdominal cavities that had swelled to accommodate the growing subjects eventually reached a point where the transformation was either complete or had failed catastrophically. There was no gentle labor, no natural process guiding the emergence. Instead, the Daemonculaba were essentially opened, their distended flesh parting to release whatever had grown inside them during those weeks of biological horror. The Iron Warriors overseeing the process approached these moments with the cold efficiency of factory supervisors inspecting a production line. They didn't care about the screaming of the Daemonculaba as their bodies were violated yet again. They didn't care about the psychological destruction of witnessing your own flesh being used as a manufacturing facility for monsters. All that mattered was the product, the end result of this obscene assembly line of suffering. Would what emerged be useful? Could it hold a bolter? Would it serve the Legion? The successful transformations, and the word successful here carries so much bitter irony it practically chokes on itself, produced something that technically qualified as a Chaos Space Marine. The gene seed had taken root. The biological modifications had progressed through the various stages of Astartes development, compressed and accelerated by the unique conditions of incubation. The subjects emerged larger, stronger, their bodies fundamentally altered at the genetic level. The implanted organs had grown and integrated. The black carapace had formed beneath their skin, They possessed the superhuman capabilities that defined the Adeptus Astartes. But they were not Space Marines in any meaningful sense. They were something else entirely, creatures born from a process so antithetical to the Emperor's original vision that they represented a complete inversion of everything the Legiones Astartes were meant to be. The original Space Marines, for all their genetic modification and surgical enhancement, were created through processes designed to elevate humanity, to produce warriors capable of defending mankind against the horrors of the galaxy. The Daemonculaba births produced warriors who were themselves products of horror, their very existence a monument to suffering and violation. The psychological state of these successful subjects defies easy description. Imagine emerging from weeks of darkness, compression, and biological horror into the harsh light of an Iron Warrior's fortress. Imagine having no memory of who you were before, your identity dissolved in a chemical soup of transformation. Imagine looking down at your hands and seeing the massive transhuman fingers of a Space Marine, knowing that this body was grown inside a mutilated woman who screamed throughout your gestation. The trauma wasn't something that happened to these subjects. It was woven into their fundamental being, part of their genetic and psychological makeup from the moment of their twisted birth. Hanzo didn't care about any of this, of course. He saw warriors, weapons to be pointed at his enemies, living proof that his methods worked. Each successful emergence validated his approach, demonstrated that the Iron Warriors didn't need the elaborate facilities and careful processes of the Loyalist chapters. They could make their own Astartes through sheer brutality and innovation. The fact that these warriors emerged from wombs of suffering rather than the sacred halls of a fortress monastery was, to Hanzo, a feature rather than a bug. It meant they owed nothing to imperial tradition, nothing to the false emperor's legacy. They were pure products of chaos, born in darkness and pain, shaped by the malevolent creativity of the Iron Warriors. The successful subjects were immediately pressed into service, their training beginning the moment they could stand on their newly transformed legs. There was no indoctrination period, no careful psychological conditioning of the kind that Loyalist chapters employed to ensure their Astartes remained stable and loyal. The Daemonculaba born were simply given weapons, shown how to use them, and pointed toward the enemy. Their education was violence, their socialization was war, their entire existence reduced to the function Hanzo had created them to serve. But here's the thing that makes even these successes so deeply disturbing. They were the minority. For every subject that emerged as a functional Chaos Space Marine, many more failed. The process was inherently unstable, the biological variables too complex to control with any reliability. Gene seed rejection, incomplete organ development, psychological collapse during incubation, physical deformity, immune system failure. 1,000 things could go wrong, and more often than not, something did. The Daemonculaba wasn't an efficient production method. It was a lottery of suffering, where the prize for winning was becoming a monster, and the price for losing was something far, far worse. The Iron Warriors kept records. Naturally, they were nothing if not methodical, even in their atrocities. They tracked success rates, identified variables that seemed to improve outcomes, refined their victim selection criteria based on observed results. Barban Falk approached the failures as engineering problems to be solved, not as human tragedies to be mourned. Each batch of subjects provided data, information that could theoretically improve future iterations of the process. The suffering was, in this cold calculus, simply the cost of research and development. What emerged from the successful births were warriors who bore the physical markers of Astartes, but lacked the institutional memory. The chapter culture, the sense of brotherhood that defined loyalist Space Marines. They were blank slates, written upon only by violence and pain. Their loyalty enforced through fear rather than earned through respect. They fought for Hansu because Hansu had created them, because they knew nothing else, because the alternative was death or worse. It was a form of slavery dressed in the trappings of military service, another layer of exploitation in a process built entirely on exploitation. The galaxy had seen many horrors in its long history. It had witnessed the birth of Slaanesh, the devastation of the Horus Heresy, the countless atrocities committed in the name of the Emperor and against him. But the Demanculaba births represented something uniquely terrible: the industrialization of violation, the transformation of creation itself into an act of desecration. Every warrior who emerged from those mutilated wombs was a living testament to what happens when intelligence is divorced from conscience, when capability serves only cruelty. For every twisted success that crawled from the Demanculaba, there were failures. So many failures. And what happened to these failures reveals perhaps the most haunting aspect of this entire atrocity: the existence of creatures so broken, so violated by the process that created them, that they became something entirely new, something that shouldn't exist but does, screaming in the darkness beneath Hansu's fortress. The unfleshed. Even the name carries a weight of horror that settles into your bones. These weren't just failed experiments to be disposed of and forgotten. They were living monuments to suffering, breathing testaments to what happens when you try to force grow Space Marines through violation and agony without any of the careful processes that the Emperor originally designed. The failures came in many forms, but they shared one defining characteristic that gave them their terrible name. They emerged from the Demanculaba without skin. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being a young boy, already traumatized beyond any hope of psychological recovery, already transformed in ways that no human body should endure, and then being expelled from that biological prison into the cold air of a chaos fortress, with no skin covering your body, every nerve exposed, every muscle visible, every movement an exercise in pure, unrelenting agony. The Demanculaba had done something to them during the incubation process, something that prevented their skin from forming properly, or caused it to be absorbed back into the host body. The exact mechanism was never fully understood, probably not even by Barbin Falk himself, but the result was consistent and horrifying. These skinless creatures emerged screaming, their bodies twisted into mockeries of the Astartes form they were supposed to become. Some had limbs that were too long or too short. Others had organs that had developed outside their bodies, pulsing and vulnerable. Their faces were masks of exposed muscle and tendon, their eyes bulging from sockets without the protection of eyelids, their mouths lipless ruins that could never fully close. They were monstrous in appearance, the stuff of nightmares given flesh, or rather, given everything except the flesh that should have covered them. And yet, despite all of this, they were alive. The gene seed had worked after a fashion. It had made them incredibly resilient, able to survive wounds and conditions that would kill any normal human instantly. But that resilience was a curse, not a blessing, because it meant they couldn't die from their condition. The Iron Warriors had no use for these failures. They couldn't serve as warriors. Their bodies were too unstable, their minds too shattered, their appearance too horrifying even for a legion that had long since abandoned any pretense of humanity. So, They were disposed of in the most callous way imaginable. They were thrown into pits beneath the fortress, cast down into the darkness like garbage, left to die in the cold and the filth. But here's the thing about creatures enhanced with gene seed, even corrupted and improperly implanted gene seed, they don't die easily. The unfleshed survived their disposal. They survived in those pits, in conditions that should have killed them within hours. They found each other in the darkness, these broken children who had been violated in identical ways, and something remarkable and terrible happened. They formed a community, a family of monsters bound together by shared suffering and mutual need. The older unfleshed, those who had been in the pits longest and had somehow learned to cope with their condition, took care of the newer arrivals. They shared whatever food they could scavenge: rats, insects, the occasional corpse thrown down from above. They protected each other from the worst of the cold, huddling together in groups despite the agony that every touch must have caused their exposed nerve endings. They developed their own crude language, their own social structure, their own understanding of the world. And at the center of this horrific society was a desperate childlike need that broke the hearts of anyone who learned of their existence. They wanted to be human, despite everything that had been done to them, despite their monstrous appearances and the constant pain of their existence. The unfleshed retained the minds of children. Traumatized, damaged children, certainly, but children nonetheless. They remembered being human, remembered having families and homes and skin. They didn't understand why they had been transformed, didn't understand why they had been thrown away like refuse. In their simple, broken way of thinking, they believed that they had done something wrong, that they were being punished for some unknown sin. They called themselves the unfleshed. Yes, but they also called themselves the children who were bad, accepting blame for their own violation because their minds couldn't process the true horror of what had been done to them. The largest and most coherent of the unfleshed took on leadership roles, becoming protectors and providers for the others. They developed a kind of worship, a desperate faith that somewhere above them, in the fortress that had created and discarded them, there was a Father who might someday forgive them and make them whole again. They didn't understand that this father figure was Hansu, the very monster who had authorized their creation and disposal. They didn't understand that the Iron Warriors viewed them as nothing more than biological waste, failed products of a manufacturing process, in their innocence. And yes, despite everything, there was still innocence there. They hoped and prayed and waited for salvation that would never come from their creators. The Demantialaba might have continued operating indefinitely, pumping out twisted mockeries of space marines for Hansu's growing warband, if not for one man's refusal to let such an atrocity stand. Captain Uriel Ventress of the Ultramarines, along with his battle brother Pausanias, found themselves in the nightmare depths of Medrengard, not by choice, but by exile. Cast out from their chapter for breaking the Codex Astartes during the campaign against the Tyranids, they had been sent on a death oath to the Eye of Terror itself, a sentence that was supposed to be their execution. Instead, it became the catalyst for one of the most desperate rescue missions ever undertaken by Astartes, operating alone and unsupported in the heart of enemy territory. Ventress and Pausanias didn't arrive at Hanso's fortress with an army at their backs. They came as prisoners, captured during their wanderings through the demon-haunted hellscape of the Iron Warriors' homeworld. They were dragged into that fortress of iron and suffering expecting torture and death, the standard fate for any Imperial warrior unfortunate enough to fall into Chaos hands. What they discovered instead was something far worse than anything they had prepared themselves for. The existence of the Daemon Kulaba wasn't known to the Imperium. This horror had been operating in secret, creating new enemies from stolen legacy and innocent flesh, and nobody outside Medrengard had any idea it existed. The moment Ventress learned what was happening in those depths, what those mutilated women were being used for, what was being done to captured children, something fundamental shifted in him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't about completing his death oath and returning to the Ultramarines. This became about stopping something so fundamentally evil that allowing it to continue would be a betrayal of everything the Astartes were supposed to represent. The theoretical warrior monk who had struggled with the rigid constraints of the Codex found his purpose crystallized in the face of absolute moral horror. The assault on the Daemonculaba facilities wasn't a military operation in any conventional sense. Ventress and Pausanias were two warriors against an entire fortress, surrounded by enemies deep in territory where no help would ever come. They had to rely on cunning, on the chaos of the ongoing conflicts between Iron Warriors factions, on the unexpected allies they found in the most unlikely places. And those allies included the unfleshed themselves, those skinless, suffering creatures who had been cast aside as failures, who remembered enough of their stolen humanity to recognize the Ultramarines as something different from their tormentors. The unfleshed's involvement in the assault represents one of the most tragically heroic moments in the entire narrative. These creatures had every reason to hate all Space Marines, to see no difference between the loyalists and the traitors who had created them through such violation. But something in them, some remnant of the Imperial faith that had been instilled in them before their capture, some desperate hope that not all warriors in power armor were monsters, led them to follow Ventress. They became his army, his shock troops, his howling vengeance against the Iron Warriors who had discarded them like refuse. The destruction of the Daemonculaba wasn't clean or surgical. It was brutal, desperate, and paid for in blood and suffering. Ventress and Pausanias fought through the fortress's depths, through hordes of Iron Warriors and their slaves, and their demon-touched war machines. They fought knowing that failure meant not just their own deaths, but the continuation of this atrocity, the endless production of more twisted Astartes, more unfleshed, more suffering without end. The unfleshed threw themselves at their former masters with a fury born of accumulated torment, tearing apart Iron Warriors with their bare hands, dying in droves, but never stopping, never retreating. When they finally reached the heart of the operation, when they stood before the Daemonculaba themselves, the decision of what to do wasn't difficult. There was no saving these women. What had been done to them couldn't be undone. Their bodies had been so thoroughly violated, so completely transformed into biological machinery, that death was the only mercy anyone could offer them. Ventress understood this with the cold clarity that comes when all other options have been stripped away. The destruction of the Daemonculaba wasn't murder. It was ending an existence that had become nothing but endless violation. The facilities burned, the mutilated women found release in death. The equipment that had sustained this horror was destroyed with the thoroughness that only Space Marines can bring to acts of demolition. Hansu's production line, his path to building an army that could challenge the greatest powers of the Eye, was shattered in a single night of fire and fury. The gene seed that hadn't yet been used was lost or scattered. The carefully maintained systems that kept the Daemonculaba alive were wrecked beyond repair, and the Iron Warriors who had overseen this operation died screaming under the claws of the very failures they had discarded. But victory came at tremendous cost. Many of the unfleshed died in the assault, their tortured bodies finally finding the peace that had been denied them since their creation. The survivors, those skinless warriors who had fought alongside the Ultramarines, couldn't simply be left behind. In Midrengard, Ventress made a decision that would have consequences he couldn't foresee. He brought the surviving unfleshed with him when he escaped the Eye of Terror, carrying these broken creatures back toward Imperial space in the hope that something could be done for them. The flames that consumed the Demenculaba chambers didn't cleanse what happened there. Nothing could. The physical machinery of atrocity was destroyed. Yes, the surgical theaters where women were transformed into living nightmares. The implantation chambers where children were fed into biological hells. The birthing pits where twisted mockeries of space marines clawed their way into existence. All of it burned. But the legacy of what Hansu and Barben Falk created there echoes through the setting in ways that transcend the simple destruction of one facility. The Demenculaba represents a threshold crossed, a demonstration of just how far Chaos Space Marines will go when desperation meets twisted ingenuity. And the consequences of that demonstration rippled outward in ways that affected everyone who touched this horror. For Uriel Ventress and Pausanias, the destruction of the Demenculaba became the defining moment of their exile. They had been cast out from the Ultramarines for breaking sacred doctrine, sent into the Eye of Terror on a death oath that no one expected them to survive. But in the depths of Midrengard, they found something that gave their exile meaning beyond mere survival. They found an atrocity so profound that stopping it became more important than their own redemption. When they finally escaped that demon world and made their way back to Imperial space, they carried with them the weight of what they had witnessed. The things they saw in those chambers, the mutilated women, the screaming births, the pit of the unfleshed, haunted them in ways that even centuries of warfare hadn't prepared them for. Ventress became harder after Midrengard, more willing to bend rules when innocent lives hung in the balance, because he had seen what happened when evil was allowed to operate unchecked in the darkness. The unfleshed themselves became the most tragic legacy of the Demenculaba's destruction. These skinless, tortured creatures had been liberated from their pit by Ventress during the assault. Their simple minds recognizing in him something that approached kindness in a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty. They followed him out of Midrengard, through the warp, all the way back to Imperial space. For a brief, heartbreaking moment, it seemed like these victims might find some measure of peace. They didn't understand why they existed or what had been done to them. They only knew pain and the vague memory of being human once, of having mothers and homes and lives before the Iron Warriors took everything from them. Ventress felt responsible for them in a way that complicated his mission, his duty, everything he had been trained to prioritize. But the Imperium doesn't offer redemption to creatures touched by chaos, no matter how innocent they might have been before their corruption. When the unfleshed reached the world of Salinas, their presence drew the attention of something far worse than the horrors they had already endured. A demon, sensing their pain and confusion, corrupted their simple minds and turned them into weapons against the very people Ventress was trying to protect. The unfleshed, who had never asked to exist, who had been violated and discarded and finally given something approaching hope, became monsters in truth. They slaughtered innocents, their childlike minds twisted by demonic influence into engines of destruction. And Ventress, the man who had freed them, was forced to put them down. Every single one. The tragedy of the unfleshed encapsulates everything that makes the Demoniolaba so horrifying. These weren't villains. They were victims, children stolen from their families and subjected to processes that destroyed everything human about them, while leaving just enough awareness to suffer. They didn't choose corruption. They didn't embrace chaos. They were simply broken so thoroughly that even salvation became impossible. When Ventress killed them, he wasn't destroying enemies. He was granting mercy to creatures whose existence was nothing but pain, whose very survival was an extension of the atrocity that created them. Hanzo, of course, survived the destruction of his facility. Chaos warlords don't die easily, and his ambition proved stronger than any single setback. He would go on to become one of the most dangerous antagonists in the setting, eventually launching an invasion of Ultramar itself in a campaign of vengeance against Ventress. But he never recreated the Demoniolaba. Whether this was due to practical limitations, the difficulty of gathering sufficient gene seed and suitable victims in the quantities required, or something else entirely, the experiment remained a singular horror. Perhaps even Hanzo recognized that some weapons cost too much to wield repeatedly. Or perhaps he simply found other, equally terrible methods of building his forces. The Demoniolaba stands as a reminder that in Warhammer 40k, there is no floor to how dark things can get. This isn't grimdark for shock value. It's a deliberate exploration of what happens when beings with superhuman capabilities and no moral constraints are given thousands of years to perfect their cruelty. The Iron Warriors pride themselves on cold efficiency, on approaching war as engineering problem. The Demoniolaba was the logical extension of that philosophy applied to the creation of life itself. If Space Marines are weapons, then manufacturing them becomes a production challenge. And if you've already abandoned every ethical consideration, if human suffering means nothing to you beyond its utility, then solutions like the Demoniolaba become thinkable. What makes this atrocity resonate with fans isn't the gore or the violation, though those elements are certainly present. It's the systematic nature of it all. This wasn't passion or rage or even sadism for its own sake. It was industry. It was process optimization applied to the most intimate horrors imaginable. Barben Falk approached the destruction of human women with the same analytical mindset he would bring to designing fortifications. Hanzo viewed the screaming, skinless failures as acceptable losses in a production run. The cold efficiency of it all somehow makes it worse than if they had simply been monsters reveling in cruelty. The legacy of the Demoniolaba is ultimately a question that the setting poses to its audience. How much darkness is too much? Where is the line between exploring the consequences of a nightmarish universe and simply wallowing in atrocity? Fans have debated this for years, and the Demoniolaba consistently comes up as either the perfect example of what makes 40k unique or a bridge too far into gratuitous horror. Both perspectives have merit. The setting's power comes from its willingness to go places other franchises won't, to show the true cost of endless war and the absolute corruption of those who have abandoned humanity entirely. But the Demoniolaba also shows something else, that even in the darkest corners of this universe, there are those who will stand against such horrors. Ventress and Pausanias didn't have to destroy that facility. They could have escaped Medrengard without ever confronting the nightmare beneath Hanzo's fortress. Instead, they chose to fight, to burn it all down, to give the unfleshed a chance at something other than eternal suffering. They failed to save those broken creatures in the end, but they tried. And in a galaxy where trying often seems pointless, where the darkness seems endless and victory impossible, that choice to fight against atrocity matters. The Daemonculaba is gone. Its victims are dead. But what it represented, the absolute depths of chaos corruption, the industrialization of suffering, the transformation of creation itself into violation, remains part of the setting's DNA. It reminds us why the Imperium, for all its own cruelties and failings, fights against the forces of chaos with such desperate ferocity. Because the alternative is a universe where things like the Daemonculaba become normal, where atrocity becomes industry, where the screams of the innocent are just background noise in the machinery of war. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and sometimes that war is the only thing standing between humanity and horrors beyond imagination. If you found yourself pulled into this nightmare alongside me, if the darkness of the 41st millennium calls to you the way it calls to so many of us, consider subscribing to join the journey deeper into the lore.